We are delighted to be able to have you here with us today, teaching us about perfectly period party platters, because cheese is life. Yes, Your Excellency, anything that you would like to add? You're pretty cheesy.
Terra Pomaria is a very cheesy place.
Yeah, I was going to say, and so are you. So it all works out well.
But welcome.
Yes, welcome, and welcome to everyone. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to you and have you officially introduce yourself with name and all.
Fabulous. Thank you, Your Excellencies. I am Marcella di Cavallino, late Avantier, currently of the Shire of Thames Reach in the Principality of Insulae Draconis in the Kingdom of Drachenwald. And I'm here to talk about cheese today. If my
Yay, cheese.
Hang on. There we are. So cheese is a huge subject with lots of paths to wander down. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is a brief history of how cheese likely happened at all, a bit about its journey into Western Europe, and then focus on its rise to power in Italy before offering a few useful guidelines on how to turn this most perfect of foods into a well-balanced cheese plate, very loosely encouraged by my good friend Bartolomeo Scappi. What I will not go into much is the science behind or the making of cheese beyond you coagulate milk and then a miracle happens. There are other people much better placed to offer instruction on making cheese, and I absolutely encourage you to seek them out to learn this very life-rewarding skill. So I have no idea who this woman is, friends, but she is dead to rights about this. So let's start at the very beginning. Picture it, Anatolia, 7000 BCE. It's the tail end of the Neolithic period, and people are thinking about settling down, maybe investing in some real estate, try to build a decent life. The Anatolian dream. For that to work, though, they needed reliable food sources, and that was best achieved through the domestication of animals. Goats and sheep, as it happens, were also interested in living la dolce vita, and so a lovely relationship was born. Humans, being prone to innovation and easy sources of food, most probably got the bright idea of milk as a food source from watching their new friends feed their young. Thankfully, human babies, it turns out, have an enzyme that allows them to process the milk sugar called lactase. The adults, it turns out, did not. So while this discovery worked out really well for the infants, it probably went less well for the grown-ups, which leads me to a myth-busting moment. Contrary to popular belief, it's because of this lactose intolerance that the idea of some nomad guy putting milk in his water skin made of a repurposed animal stomach on one end of his journey and magically discovering cheese on the other end doesn't really hold up. The responses to lactose intolerance were probably the same then as they are today. So intentionally setting yourself up for a trip filled with runny poo and bathroom breaks seems deeply, deeply unlikely. Meanwhile, somewhere within the next 5,000 years that followed or so, our Anatolian friends figured out heat sources, which led to pottery. Pottery led to better milk storage possibilities. Milk storage led to random fermentation through free-floating bacteria in the air. And fermentation, friends, is what led to curds. Fermentation is, for the uninitiated, broadly speaking, a process that converts the sugars in a thing. And you'll remember that it was the sugars that were hard to digest past infancy. So while this development was less meaningful for the infants, it started to work out very well for the grown-ups. It's also around this time that the possibility of rennet, which is the stomach lining of livestock, might have been experimented with as a coagulant on demand, rather than having to rely on random airborne bacteria. About 1,000 years later, our Anatolian friends had grown up, moved out of their parents' hut, and chased their destiny into Northern Europe. With this diaspora came lots of changes and opportunities to meet up with dairy-producing animals like cattle, but it also meant an important evolution in humans, lactose tolerance. So now we're in the boom time of early civilization. People were living in groups and forming communities, most notably the city of Uruk. This meant that space was needed for buildings. So our animal friends were pushed out to the fringes and often taken as large groups to really great grazing areas, a thing called transhumanance, which improved the quality of the dairy and the wool that they produced. At the same time, transportation solutions improved, literally with the invention of the wheel, so people could get their very nice dairy and wool products to other communities, which spun up a lively trade. Underscoring the importance of dairy and cheese to these, our ancestors, was the rise of the cult of Inanna in Uruk. The legend reports that the goddess, when selecting her husband from amongst her human followers, wisely chose the shepherd Dumuzi because he could keep her in a regular supply of milk, yogurt, butter, and of course, cheese, where the other guy can only give her money. And why have that when you can have cheese? This led to offerings of these things, both during the special yearly rites and every day, in order to keep the Queen of Heaven happy and taking care of her people. Probably goes without saying that as religious cults go, this one was getting a lot of things right. So for anyone familiar with religion, it should come as no surprise that with all of these offerings, the temples got involved with the management and maintenance of flocks and their produce, which in turn led to the development of clear writing and accounting so they could keep track of their cheese. It didn't take long for the city of Ur to become a major center for dairy production, as related on the cuneiform tablets we all know and love. Also around this time, the Bible tells a story of Abraham serving curds to God and two of his angels who'd just popped by for a visit, indicating, first of all, that there was more widely spread lactose tolerance in adults, but also the elevated status of cheese as a food. By the time of Abraham, cheese was big business, but because it was perishable and difficult to transport, probably mostly limited to the ruling and temple elite. However, by this time, written evidence supports several different terms for cheese, including additives, flavors, size, and shape. Moving westward in the waning millennia of BCE, trade drove innovations in preservation and transportation. Salt had been used broadly as a preservative for quite some time, so applying it to the outside of a lump of cheese made sense. What that did, though, was to dry the cheese out quite a bit and turn it into something akin to modern pecorino. What that also did, however, was to draw out the moisture and turn it into brine, creating a cheese very similar to what we now call feta. Both of these were significantly easier to transport across the Mediterranean to the hungry folks in Greece. At the same time, a bunch of people who had found their way to the Alps and places further north were developing their own dairying culture, which included cattle along with their goats and sheep. Another benefit of this region was the availability of cold storage, which is useful enough just by itself, but this particular innovation allowed for something new: aging. Cheese was common with the Celtic people by this time, and their and other migrations led to Italy and Sicily becoming major producers of rennet coagulated cheeses in the first millennium BCE. And I'm just going to stop for a second and say coagulated because it's one of the funnest words I've had to say repeatedly in a very long time. So anyway, that puts us in Italy. So by the time of the Etruscans, cheese had broadly developed into two distinct camps: dry cheese, or Caseus aridus, and wet cheese, Caseus mollis. Other technologies started springing up around this time, including a preponderance of cheese graters in Etruscan tombs, as well as the development of clay milk boilers, which was an innovation to keep heat coagulated cheeses from boiling over and losing all the tasty curd. So while fresh ricotta style cheeses have been around more or less since the beginning, there was also a shift toward aged pecorino and caprino, which come from the Italian words for sheep and goat. Literally, that's what they mean. Also, food writing got its start around this time, but unlike the bloggers of today, it was with agriculturalists, not foodies. So in the 2nd century BCE, Cato the Elder wrote De Agro Cultura, a sort of farming manual for Roman estates. He really only focused on dairying as a secondary product to olive oil and wine, but certainly had opinions about how big of a flock different sized estates should have and the types of cheese that should be produced from them. His suggestion that half the cheeses be dry, which likely means types made early in the season, then dried and ripened for a few months, implies that tenant cheesemakers likely had access to at least a remedial aging facility, probably just a shack with some shelves, but also with a bit of temperature regulation. Dry cheeses were very popular with the Roman elite and probably made the estate some decent money through sales. A few years later, Varro penned his Rerum Rusticarum, another farming manual, but more in-depth and practical than Cato's. By this time, estates typically had multiple flocks of sheep. Varro, having grown up on an estate himself, detailed everything from flock management to shepherd management. He was also the first to discuss rennet coagulation in terms of actual measurements and preferred sources, and for my vegetarian and vegan friends, was the first to write about using a combination of fig sap and vinegar as a coagulant. Columella was, and I quote, the most comprehensive, systematic, and arguably the most impressive agriculturist of antiquity. He emphasizes quality control from the start, suggesting that one never use more than the absolute minimum amount of rennet needed for coagulation because, as we now know, too much can lead to fat and protein breakdown during aging, which will ruin the cheese. He also offered advice on temperature maintenance during coagulation and setting, as well as alternate coagulants. Importantly, Columella understood that achieving high-quality cheese was a delicate balancing act of proper moisture control. By the time Columella was writing, several regions in the Italian peninsula were known for their exceptional cheeses, so available varieties were already starting to appear and move into other markets. Marshall, a poet and author, documented his favorite cheeses in Xenia, the 13th book of his series on hospitality. Marshall broadly talked about 4 domestic cheese regions: Vestine, Trebula, Velabrum, and Luna. Vestine cheese, a product of the central part of the peninsula, was apparently very common as a breakfast cheese. Trebula cheese, from around what is now Abruzzo, Lazio, and Umbria, was prized as an excellent cheese for using in cooking. Velabrum cheeses hailed from the greater Rome area and were frequently smoked. Pliny the Elder commented on these in particular at some point, indicating that smoked goat milk cheese was especially delicious. So all of you people that are out there with goats that make cheese, write that down. Luna cheese was big. Apparently, it was also tasty, but the important point here is that cheesemaking innovation had advanced by this time to the point where cheesemakers could manage the delicate balance of moisture control that Columella talked about in remarkably large quantities. At the same time, all of these shenanigans were happening further down the countryside. Celtic folks wandered over the Alps into the northern part of the peninsula and brought their cows, technology, and dairy culture with them. I just really like that animation. I kind of want to do it again. Anyway, by the Middle Ages, though, things started really getting good. Over time, the grand Roman villas became medieval manor farms made up of great big tracts of farmland, large collections of livestock, and mouths to feed. With the rise of Christianity and the subsequent communities came the development of monasteries made up of great big tracts of land, large collections of livestock, and mouths to feed. Where Romans had slaves to do all the heavy lifting, though, as it were, manor farms and monasteries had peasants as tenant farmers, maintaining that age-old tradition of the haves and the have-nots. Thankfully, though, all of these people made and ate cheese, and people needing to do the best they could with limited resources is where things really started to take off. So when you're a peasant, if you're lucky, you might have one cow or sheep or goat of your own that you're at least responsible for. But making it a reasonable amount of cheese takes a fairly large amount of milk. So it's wildly unlikely that you'd get enough in a single milking to make decent cheese, which means you're keeping it all in a bucket somewhere and adding to it until you have enough to be useful. This extended storage creates an interesting environment for things like lactic acid bacteria, which has a profound impact on how cheese develops and matures. By the early Middle Ages, especially in cooler climates, this was leading to some pretty glorious bloomy rind and washed rind cheeses, similar to brie. Alpine cheeses from points further north also continued to evolve during the early Middle Ages. The same transhumance that we saw in ancient times was very much at play here. Dairy livestock from combined tenant farming families were herded up the mountains in the spring, milked, and cheeses made and aged in chalets built up there for that purpose. The huge volume of milk that they generated, plus the limited space for cheese making, though, meant that cheese was often being made twice a day, sometimes immediately, and sometimes the next day after the milk was left to cool overnight. The resulting cheese was given back to the community who ate it, of course, but it also was used to pay part of their tenancy to the local abbey. The enormous volume of milk produced also meant that cheeses needed to be fairly large as well as durable and long-lived in order to survive the trek back down the mountain and then further afield. These cheesemakers developed manufacturing innovations to reduce the need for salt in preserving and aging, so they didn't have to haul heavy bags of this crap up the mountains with them. But they still needed to make a cheese that would be dry enough to be durable and that would age well. The results of these innovations were a collection of cheeses with sturdy rinds, firm elastic innards, and a nutty flavor. A Gruyere is a really great example of this style. Another delicious surprise developed out of being able to store cheeses in caves, which conveniently tend to maintain a constant, usefully cool temperature. This is great for aging cheeses, but as it happens, it's also great for the growth of some molds. Cheeses made by a slower rennet coagulation, no cooking, and heavy salting end up with a high acid and salt content, which certain strains of mold really like. Turns out humans really like it too. So cheesemakers refined their processes to encourage this mold growth, and that's how we have the gloriousness of blue cheese. Roquefort's a good example of this. It's a sheep's milk blue cheese style that dates to the 11th century from the Roquefort region of France that for a while was a part of a vast monastic enterprise that included a near monopoly by Templars and other orders, because of course they did. It wouldn't be a presentation about cheese in Italy without talking about the hard Grana-style cheeses. These originated in the Po Valley of northern Italy and were largely developed in the Alpine tradition. While no one is certain when these types first appeared, they were well on their way by the 14th century. These cheeses are characterized by their hardness, which is achieved by a heavier-handed application of salt compared to their Alpine brethren, smaller curds, and extensive cooking, which is much easier to do in the lowlands than it is on the side of a mountain. So this made for a higher salt, lower moisture cheese that made it really quite durable and much easier to age for longer. And this allowed cheesemakers to make the enormous wheels that you see today. Everything about this process set these cheeses on the road to immediate and long-lasting popularity. They were large, indestructible, tasty, and convenient to Venice, one of the world's largest trade cities, making these Parmesan-style cheeses highly prized trade goods, even as far away as England. Two recent sources really stand out as definitive from this period. First, we know a lot about the cheese trade in the high to late Middle Ages because of a merchant from Prato named Francesco Dattini, whose extensive account books and records were discovered in the late 19th century and provide an incredible look not only into his life, but that of the merchant class in general in the 14th and 15th centuries. Additionally, the letters between himself and his wife, who stayed in Prato while he lived and worked in Florence, also provide excellent insight into the running of medieval households. Dattini got his start in the arms trade, but his business eventually shifted to providing luxury goods to cardinals, which included busy trading in cheese. From his records, we get a clear listing of the types of cheeses that were available and popular, their provenance, the different grades, their worth, and who bought them. His records are an invaluable resource when it comes to cheese. A few years later, a guy named Pantaleone di Confienza, which is an excellent name, basically lived my best life by becoming a travel cheese writer. He traveled around Europe, eating cheese, asking questions, and compiling what he learned into his book, Summa Lacticiniorum, I hope I said that right, which roughly translates to a compendium of milk products. It was the first book to be written about a single ingredient. And it quickly became popular among both cheese producers and cheese eaters, and was the definitive treatise on cheese for the next few hundred years. Which, at long last, brings us to the Renaissance. So originally my plan was to dive into my good friend Bartolomeo Scappi's opera for ideas and information about cheese and maintain a laser-like focus so I didn't go off the rails. But as many of us know, we make a research plan and the gods laugh. It was the starting point for my look into Italian cheeses, though, so I want to give him at least a bit of a nod. Amongst this extensive and thorough instruction for his apprentices, Scappi very thoughtfully included a selection of menus, one of which is what a well-appointed banquet sideboard ought to include, which is basically an extensive shopping list of snacks. He lists quite a few cheeses, largely by region, but also by season. You can only really get fresh cheeses when animals are in milk, for example, and those times come and go throughout the year. Scappi names a fairly broad selection in his list, some fresh, some cooked, some aged. He was living and working in Rome at this point, so local cheese would naturally make an appearance, but he also mentions cheeses from much further afield. One that I find particularly interesting is milk snow, which he mentions in a few places, but leaves open to interpretation. Based on the serving suggestions in other menus, he says to serve milk snow with sugar, for example. I'm guessing it's something akin to a mascarpone or another light sweet cheese. He doesn't mention keeping it chilled, so I'm guessing it won't be something like whipped cream or ice cream as I've seen it presented by others. It's all very curious, and this is probably going to be a little rabbit hole for me. Another part of my plan was to provide you all with a list of cheeses that were common in the 16th century Italy and are still easy enough to get today. This is that list. As you can see, there were and are a lot of options with a lot of variety. If you find yourself at a loss for some of them, though, remember that imports were also common and potentially a good show of wealth, so it's easy to fill in gaps with more common Alpine or French cheeses. This list will be available after this session, just FYI. But it does lead me to the best thing about cheese, which is eating it. So in the world of cheese plates, there are typically 5 main categories of cheese: fresh, bloomy and soft, cooked and pressed, washed rind, and blue. Or these categories: sharp, creamy, funky, nutty, and fresh. Or these: creamy, soft, semi-hard, semi-soft, hard, goat, and blue. Really doesn't make that much difference in the end, though. When you're putting a well-crafted cheese plate together, you really just want a varied selection to provide a variety of tastes and textures and to keep things interesting. You'll also want to mix up cow, sheep, and goat cheese, both for variety's sake, but also in case some of your friends have issues specifically with cow dairy, which is the most common. So here's the previous list of cheeses ordered by category according to the first version on the previous slide. The point isn't necessarily to be prescriptive about it. It's important to eat cheese that you like, but this is a place to begin. There are what seems to be an infinite number of cheeses available in Italy these days, but all of the ones listed here can be dated to the 16th century or earlier, even mascarpone. So I'll take you through what I believe to be the easiest representative cheeses to find in modern shops. I think you'll be surprised and delighted to discover how easy it will be to compose your perfectly period party platter. Appropriate fresh cheeses are easy to find. Ricotta or caprino, which is a fresh goat milk cheese, you might know it as chèvre in French, are readily available. When looking for ricotta, try to find a higher end type that has an internal draining situation within the container and a light texture. For caprino, look for something without a rind. These goat cheeses often come in flavored varieties, like with added herbs or dried fruit, things like that. Arguably, bloomy means a bit of a suede-like rind, which you can find with a taleggio or a fontina. But honestly, an Italian cheese plate would be naked without a nice, soft buffalo mozzarella. Italians have been making cheese from local water buffalo for centuries, so try to find a proper mozzarella di bufala if you can. Scappi mentions it in its smoked counterpart, provatura, so you have some options. Burrata, sadly, is a 20th century creation, so you'll have to keep it simple for this one. Parmesan is the king of cheeses, with some truly deep history and lore. It's been used as currency, and cheesemakers keep their product under lock and key. It's gloriously salty. If you're looking for an alternative, pecorino is its sheep's milk cousin, and no less glorious. Fontina, Italy's popular entry into the Alpine style cheeses, also falls into this category. It's smoother, a bit less salty, but so, so good. Not gonna lie, taleggio has stolen a bit of my heart. It's gooey and smooshy and a bit stinky, very brie-like in its presentation, but very much its own thing. I can find it at the grocery store here in the UK, but you might need to chase up specialty cheese shops in the States to find it, which will absolutely be worth your time. The same goes for Castelmagno, which is another gloriously squishy, a bit funky, and delicious cheese. Hands down, the most famous Italian blue is Gorgonzola. It comes in 2 types based on its age: Dolce, which is younger and milder, and Picante, which is older and sharper. It doesn't have the face-slapping funk of, say, a Stilton, but it's still really interesting and complex and delicious. It's also an excellent starter blue cheese for people who have the fear about the blues. And there's more to a good cheese plate than just cheese. Fresh and dried fruits, nuts, and charcuterie and crackers are all mentioned by Scappi in his shopping list of snacks, and all add texture and interest to your cheese plate landscape. You could probably also include preserved and pickled vegetables and mushrooms, as these were definitely found in a well-appointed 16th century larder. Broadly speaking, though, keeping it seasonal is a good bet and an appropriate choice. Before I end, there are just a few more things I want to mention. As is right and proper, the list of books I referenced for this bit of research. If you're interested in cheese history of other areas of Europe during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, I highly recommend Cheese and Culture by Paul Kinstedt. He's seriously done his homework, and it's an incredibly good read, just for the sake of reading. Arguably, Ned Palmer's Cheesemonger's History of the British Isles is what really got me to think about all of this stuff in the first place. It's another well-written history written by someone who truly loves the product and the process, so it's a good one for your cheese library. Meanwhile, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at events in the broader Principality of Insulider Conus in the Kingdom of Drachenwald. If that's too much of a hike, feel free to drop me a line by email or follow me on my project blog, An Everyday Italian, where I ramble on about my projects, ideas, philosophies, and other nonsense related to 16th century daily life in Florence and the SCA. Thanks for listening.
This is Wolfwin from the Mid-Realm.
Hello.
Related to Parmigiano, do you happen to know whether Locatelli dates to period or not?
I don't have the answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
I was under the impression that ricotta cheese, unlike other cheeses, which are made from the whole milks, ricotta is made from the leftover whey, which is the reason why I can't tolerate it. Do you happen to know anything about that?
I do. I think that is a method to make it. When I was talking about ricotta, I was meaning more like the basic cottage cheese or farmer's cheese, which is everyone's sort of like entry level cheese experience and the basis for essentially basis for most cheese generally.
I see.
I haven't, yeah. And I mean, like I said, I'm not diving too deeply into how cheese is actually made. That's just not really my jam. I just like to eat it basically. But yeah, I think you are correct that modern ricotta is definitely made with the leftover whey because there's still some proteins left from the first cheese process pressing thing.
Period ricotta is also from whey. Ricotta means recooked. And ricotta cheese has a different protein in it than other cheeses, which is perhaps why the lady with the question has different tolerance.
Clara, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only other thing I know about cheese is my own experience making paneer type cheese, where one adds an acid or a base to precipitate the proteins as one cooks it under a moderate temperature, but that's about it.
Yeah, I've made a lot of cheese, so on the technical cheese making questions, I can have some answers.
Brilliant. Aspasia, you have your hand up?
Aspasia, yes.
Sorry.
Yes, from Heartwood in Ontier, Kingdom of Ontier. I was wondering, I never hear Romano. Does it fit in or not? And just curious, because that's what I usually get. I haven't tried the pecorino.
Yeah, so pecorino is a sheep's milk version of Parmesan, basically. And Romano is very similar. I didn't run across that name specifically in the really quick research I did to prep for this class.
Okay.
But you know what, I'm happy to look it up. And if you want to ping me on email, I can follow up with you on that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wolfwin?
Would you mind putting the slide with your contact info back up, please?
I'm happy to do that. There you are. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Wow, you speak really fast. I'm from
Sorry.
Mountain in Meridios, which is in the south, and we speak slow and we listen slow. So I was wildly writing notes. Are you going to give a handout out or anything at the end? 'Cause
Yeah. Yeah, I
wow.
am. I didn't have my act together to have it ready to go in time for this, but I will absolutely have it available in the next week or so. So if you want to ping me on email, I'm happy to send that out to you.
Well, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed it. I learned so much.
I'm glad.
So, Marcella, I had a question as well.
Yeah.
You briefly touched on the dried fruits or the fruits in general. Do you have some recommendations for fruits that you feel fully set off one's party platter?
I personally like a combination of fresh and dried. Like dried apricots are always really solid. And then the quote at the beginning mentioned that pears and Parmesan go together like hand in glove, which is always really lovely. I like apples a lot. If they're in
Pears
season,
and blue cheese.
yeah,
Sorry.
also really good. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's just whatever you like. Like, so if you like raisins, have raisins. But I'm a big fan of marinated mushrooms as part of the whole ensemble. And this, like, I didn't touch on charcuterie, which is a class in itself that somebody else needs to teach. But they're including bits of meat with your cheese, also quite nice if that's your jam. But yeah, I pretty much like to stick to things that are seasonal as much as possible, just because that makes it cheaper to purchase and lovely and kind of more in the period style of things, since they didn't have the same sorts of shopping opportunities that we have.
I did see someone mention figs as well, and I yes, I know. One of these years, my fig trees are actually going to produce and ripen. That's the part I have to. It will ripen, and I will be able to eat it, and not pay $5 for 4.
Would they have used pomegranate? Because my understanding is pomegranate was like the thing.
Possibly. I mean, if they had, especially in wealthy households, if they had access to it and if it would make them look really, really good to their friends, then they probably threw it down. Yeah. Look at my pomegranate that came from very far away. It's so sexy.
Right? It's all about that street cred.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. So I'm just scrolling through the chat to see if there's anything that I missed.
In regard to the charcuterie,
Yes.
there's a Facebook group for cured meats, history of cured meats. It's called the Saluminati. And in the files of that is a link to a Google Doc, which lists all of the meat curing recipes in period that Master Wolfric has found. So
Excellent.
if you wanted to make sure that your charcuterie was something that they likely had, you can refer to that.
Do you know who the best nerds are? Food nerds, hands down.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with this.
Tasty nerds.
After all, everybody has to eat.
It's true.
And cheese nerds are called curd nerds.
Curd nerds. Love it. Love it.
Zero
Oh.
opinions about cheese. I've noticed this. Yes.
We digress. Are there any other questions that I can make up answers to?
And this is why we love you. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's entirely possible for us to discuss cheese somewhat ad
All night
nauseum.
long.
So,
Yeah.
oh, let's see. Someone says because brie is called for in a specific Italian recipe.
All right. Fair cop, Eden. Fair. Yeah. Still, why have brie when you can have taleggio? I ask. Could you see the cheese list one more time? Yes. As soon as I figure out what incredibly clever place I put it. Is that the one you were looking for? Oh, wait.
Oh, look.
Much better with animations. Isn't that sexy? There we go.
See, now we're gonna have to start sending you cheese platter porn pictures. Yes.
If you could all please just spam me with the photographs of the cheese platters you put together, that would absolutely warm my heart.
With alliterative titles as well.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Has anybody else read This Cheese Plate Will Change Your Life?
No, but I'm writing that title down.
So it's a book, and the author also has a really active Instagram. And her whole thing is not just like how to pick and pair things, but cool ways to arrange the cheeses and meats on the tray to look super duper appetizing.
Nice.
So, because that's always been my problem. I'm like, here is a plate with cheese. That should be sufficient. But I also want to look sexy.
I had grand plans of like actually getting to the store and putting something together so I could do a proper show and tell, but I just did not have my poop in a group for this. I'm sorry. But yeah, please do spam all the photographs of your cheese plates.
We've finished ours, otherwise it would be a sterling example. Yeah, it's interesting how much as Scadians we do tend to rely on things like, cheese and meat as our quick and easy go-to. I would live on cheese and meat if allowed, but
I mean, it's perfect for events, right? You don't necessarily have to refrigerate it. It's delicious for all 16 meals of the day.
Yes.
Said the Hobbit.
Indeed.
It's not allowed during Lent.
I know. Sadness.
Maybe you should give
wait a minute. So what
cool.
about Easter? What about the day before Easter? I'm going to an event on the 16th out of town, and I need to take food for the day, and I want to be as Florenzian as I can be. So no cheese?
Sell indulgences. Then you can have your cheese.
Okay. I'm going to be bribing her grace, so I have to have cheese.
oh my goodness. There's an entire side adventure now opening up from just this one class, and we'll have people wandering around selling indulgences. Please buy an indulgence. I need to have some cheese.
Hey, this is why I go to summer events. We're way past Lent. I don't have to worry about it.
Oh man. See, this is also a good reason to have an Islamic persona, honestly.
All right, before I love devolving because we get all chatty. But Marcella, do you have any final words before I end the recording? And then
Nope, just thanks everybody for coming. I really enjoyed looking into all of this stuff and sharing it with you. And please do feel free to spam me with pictures of your cheese plates. And I look forward to hearing stories of you impressing all your friends with cheese that you bought at the grocery store that is perfectly period. That's it.
Thank you.
Excellent. So he's going
Thank
to go.
you for the title too. I do like a lovely little alliteration.
I try to use my powers for good.